So my talk will be about Android updates to new versions. And I talked about this before, because in Android 8, Google released something that they called Project Treble. And this was a huge re-architecture of Android. And in Android 10, on last Google I/O, they announced continuation of the thing, and they called it Project Mainline. So naturally, I was very interested, and I decided I'll talk about it and how it's related to Treble, how it's a continuation of Treble. And in the end, there was so much new stuff on Project Mainline that I practically ended up doing the presentation primarily about Project Mainline. There are only a few slides about Treble, and unfortunately I will not have enough time to talk about it. So what will I talk about today? First, I'll try to explain what's the problem with updates in Android. And a lot of you probably know about this, but I'll just need to introduce the villain, why they needed to solve this. Then I'll talk about Project Treble just a little bit, what's all about, very shortly, with almost no details. I'll explain the results of Project Treble, because now Google published how they speeded up the update, so I'll touch on this. But I'll explain why it was not enough and why they needed Project Mainline. And the last part will be the most interesting one, in my opinion, because I'll try to explain why it's all important to you, if you are an Android developer or if you just have Android phone in your pocket. So this presentation will be relevant to you even if you do not develop for Android, or if you do not do Android devices like I do. And I'll even try to guess where it's all going. But this will be like make guesswork. So what's the problem? What they try to solve, right? Well, if you're an Android developer, you know this picture, and this basically tells you everything you need to know. This was before Treble, and this is the fragmentation of Android ecosystem between the different Android versions. Basically, a lot of users have old versions of Android on their phones. And that's a problem for users because they don't get the new features. That's a problem for Android developers. For you, I guess, in most of the cases. So, because you need to support all these multiple Android versions. And that's a problem for Google, because that's like the biggest disadvantage of Android over iOS. Because with iOS, people update to the latest version and get the latest features like instantly. 2 months, everybody on the latest iOS version. 2 months after they released new Android, nobody has it, still. But what is the reason? Why is that so different between Android and iOS? And the reason is basically this. It's not really even technical, it's just the way of open source, because Android is open source. There are many people, many companies who all parts of something called Open Handset Alliance, and that's alliance that Google leads, but all these companies on the screen, they are part of this alliance. I'm not actually sure about Huawei anymore, but that's a different story. Okay, why it's a problem that all these guys work on Android? Well, if you have a lot of developers working on the same code, that's great, right? They can do a lot of stuff. They can write new features, fix bugs, right? And that's great. But the problem is when you have a lot of people from different companies working on the same code, and that's the case with Android operation system. They tend to break stuff of each other. So we need a lot of process to synchronize them, right? To make sure that one people from I don't know, Samsung, don't break stuff of people that, from Qualcomm, for example. That's what they did. So this involves a lot of process that looks like this, with specifically updates of Android. Basically, with updates, the way it works, when Google releases the new version of Android, it only runs on Pixel devices, right, from Google. And then other guys need to adapt they need to make it work on their hardware. And they do it in steps. Before anyone from the device vendor, like Samsung, before Samsung can do anything, they need to get something from their chip vendor, from silicon vendor, like Qualcomm. So, before Treble, like before Android 8, this all happened in steps. Google releases their part, they give it to Qualcomm, Qualcomm does their part, they give it to Samsung, Samsung does their part. They give it to people, to you. And not always it actually happened, because Samsung or Qualcomm may decide to not to do it. But even they all decided to do it, it still takes like 6 to 12 months. That's optimistic, actually. Usually it can take longer, actually. But this was the problem. They all needed to do it one by one, and the problem was technical. It was in Android architecture, and that's why they needed Project Treble. So, Project Treble, if I talk about it shortly, it's like this. It's very complicated. Guys, they've changed the whole architecture of operation system, like in Android 8. You won't believe how much they've changed, because you think that's the same operation system you have on your phone. After Android 8, it's completely different. You just don't know it. So this is like the easiest picture you can get about what Project Treble is all about. Not all about it. It's like 10% of Project Treble, really easy explained. This is this picture. So I'm not going to talk about Project Treble almost at all, except for this one. This is like the simplest picture that Google gives you. And basically what this picture tells you is that before Treble, device vendors and chip vendors, they couldn't work in parallel because they kind of worked on the same code, so they had to take turns. And after Project Treble, they created an interface between what chip vendors do and what device vendors do. So this was called vendor interface, and basically they created this separation of responsibility between vendor of the chip and vendor of the device. And this separation was on something that's called HAL, Hardware Abstraction Layer. This is practically an API that they've introduced, and this API was mandatory for both chip vendor and device vendor to follow. And this API had versions, and it was stable. And that meant that you have this wonderful thing called backward compatibility, when new version of Android could work with all drivers from vendor. So this was the big thing about Project Treble, a stable API that separated Android in two parts. And this API was backward compatible. So did it work? This is the picture that Google released very recently about Project Treble. And basically, they take on this works. This is like adoption speed. You can see the days on this axis and how many users you have for the latest Android version. And with Oreo, with Android 8, you have this speed, and with Android Pie, you have speed twice fast, right? So it's like, hey, Treble works, now updates happen 2 times faster. Well, if you look at the days since launch, right? To get here, they needed 400 days still. I mean, it's 2 times faster, but it's still more than a year. So it's basically said, yeah, it's like, previously it was 3 years to get guys to the latest version of Android. Now it's a year and a half. Great, we won, right? Well, iOS is still way better than you. So yeah, they made things better. It was a step in the right direction, but it wasn't enough, right? Because what Google wanted in the end is push updates of the operation system directly to you, to users, to the phones, because right now it goes through all these silicon vendors, device vendors still, but they want to push it directly. So they want from step 1 to step 5 immediately, if you remember the last picture. And that's why they needed Mainline, the next project. But they still took 2 things that worked in Treble. One, they decided that's a good idea to divide code into areas of responsibility to different parties. And two, stable interfaces worked. Backward compatibility is important. That's what they took from Treble, and they wanted to apply it in Project Mainline. So, what Project Mainline is all about? It was announced on the last Google I.O. Like this spring. So it's very new. I'm also going to talk about this. And basically what they say is that Project Mainline allows you to update certain components of the system directly by Google through Google Play. So it's like an application which is updated through Google Play. Like Samsung is not involved, Qualcomm is not involved, directly from Google to your phone. But it's only for certain modules. And what is a module? Well, module is actually any component of the system that they decided that they want to turn into a module. It could be application, could be service, could be a library, could be anything on the device, any kind of entity. And there are two formats for a module. It's either APK, which you already know, because that's what they used for applications, and Apex, a new thing, new format, Android Pony Express. Well, Android Pony Express is a new format of a container that they introduced specifically for Mainline in Android 10. It's a very new thing, and basically it's for lower layer components like libraries, like native services, stuff like that. Because APK was good for applications. But for lower layer services, it's kind of not so well, because sometimes you need something to start up really early in the boot sequence, and APK doesn't work yet at this point, so they introduced new format. So this is how Apex file looks. And basically, it's similar to APK, because you still have Android manifest XML, which means that package manager and the rest of like infrastructure that APK used can be applied to Apex. But it also has a JSON manifest, which is basically just a name and a version of the module, Apex pub key. And that's basically a key which will be used to check that updated version still comes from the same vendor, or from Google in this case. And the main part is image. Basically, image is a payload. It's what's important. It's what holds the library or service that you want to update inside. And the Apex files will be handled by a new daemon called Apex Manager, which will be running on all Android devices. And Apex Manager is a daemon which downloads new versions of the modules, finds the latest version, checks that it's key, that it's signed by the right authority, and then it mounts this image, this payload, on /Apex partition. So it's basically like if you downloaded a file and then you plugged it into a flash, like flash drive that you plugged into a phone. So this like new module will be residing in this separate partition. So this is how modules get to you, but how they interact with the rest of the system and with each other. Because modules come directly from Google, but the rest of the system, it comes from Samsung or from basically from your device vendor. So it needs to be compatible, right? And they designed 3 rules that every module should follow to be compatible with the rest of the system. First one, modules don't introduce new APIs. It basically means that there is no, like old system can still rely that the same API will be present for a module even if it's updated. Second, modules only use SDK and system APIs that are guaranteed by CTS, compatibility test suite. For you who do know what CTS is, it's basically a million unit tests that Google runs on every device they certify to make sure that API, like application API, works correctly. So basically this means that every device should work the same way, should provide the same API. So that's the way for a module to be sure that the API that you use are there. And third one, modules communicate only with each other and use only stable C API or stable ADL interface. And stable ADL interface is something new. Basically, they introduced it in Android 10, and it's very similar to current ADL interfaces. So ADL is Android Interface Definition Language, if you don't know. And that's basically how you define an interface in Android, usually, for your service. This is like special language to define an interface. And now they enhanced it. They did something called stable API. And basically it's stable. They did some conditions to make it stable. The important part here, that's very similar to what they done at Treble, is stable ADL interface have versions. And they allow, again, for backward compatibility. And this tool, it's not specific for Google. You can actually use it if you are a developer now. So stable ADL interfaces, you can look into this. It's like ADL, but slightly different. So what have they moved into modules right now in Android 10? Because before now I've just talked about what modules are, how they interact, basically all this infrastructure stuff. Well, there are 10 things they moved into module right now. And I color-coded them so you can see that half of them are APKs and half of them are APIXs. So it's like no preference again to any format. And all these 10 modules, Google separates into 3 bins: security, privacy, and consistency, by benefits that they provide. So security and privacy are kind of obvious. Security updates are important to get fast to users, because if there is security vulnerability, you want to fix it fast. You don't want to wait while Samsung does it. Privacy is about user permissions, about user data. So again, if there is a vulnerability there, is there a bug in privacy, you want to fix it fast. And consistency, well, it's actually kind of a mystery for me, because it says device stability, compatibility, developer consistency. That's all great things, but it's not related to upgrades, really. I mean, how fast upgrades related to these things, right? So let's start with a simple one, security. There are 3 modules on security. All 3 of them are APIX files. First one is Conscript. If you don't know, Conscript is basically everything about security in Android. This is all about cryptography, like SSL, stuff like this. Now it's going to be directly delivered from Google to you without any chance for Samsung or anybody to change anything. Okay. DNS resolver. Again, makes sense. It's very common to have attacks on DNS, and basically this is something that Google wants to fix fast. So the idea again with security, they want to fix security issues fast. As soon as they know there is a vulnerability in Android, they want to get the fix to your device. The final one is media. Media is not something you bring to mind immediately after you talk about security, but actually there are a lot of vulnerabilities in some parts of the media framework, and this is a big framework in Android. There are a lot of stuff related to video and audio inside Android about media. So part of it, just part of it, is now a module. The interesting part here is that there is a way for device vendors to use APIX format and this whole mainline thing to deliver their updates on media codecs and frame extractors. This is like a deviation from the overall idea that this is Google doing updates through Play Store. I'm not going to talk about this much because I don't have the time, but this is very interesting actually. If you want to look into the details, you can come to me and I'll talk about it with you later. Privacy, next thing. This is basically everything about permissions. You know that Android 10 has new updated permission framework, so this is done through module, and basically this is like 3 different APKs. Like first one is permission controller, second one is documents UI, so this is about permissions for documents access, and the third one is X services, which is basically just a few very obscure services. There is an interesting quote though about in documentation about this that basically says that they moved it to module in response to the change in privacy landscape and government regulations. I think it's somehow related to European GDPR law. If you know about this, it's about like saving your private data and how government changed the laws around this. And basically Google just says, okay, we're tired of doing it slow. Like if there is a scandal about some private data being leaked, we want to fix it fast. So that's another way for them to deal with it, like updates fast, everything related to privacy. Consistency. Like I said, it's the least obvious one, and it's actually the most interesting one. And the reason it's most interesting is this module, runtime. Well, if you look at what's inside this module, and if you know Android operation system really well, you'll be blown away, like I was. Because art, like virtual machine, is in this module right now. So is Bionic. So everything about C language is here in this module. Everything about like managed core library is like a bunch of the very basic libraries, right? It's like most basic. Basically, this module is now the heart of Android. And you know, so this is huge, right? This is like Samsung cannot optimize virtual machine anymore. So if you're a developer and you know that, for example, Samsung or Xiaomi was problematic because everything works on all other devices but not on these ones, this is like the step for, this is like for you. They cannot modify a lot of stuff now. Samsung, anybody. And the crazy thing about it, there are actually 2. First one is they didn't announce it on Google I/O. There were all other 9 modules were announced on Google I/O, and this one wasn't, the biggest one. They tell no one, Google. And they did, like, it's in their documentation right now, but they still haven't made any, like, loud announcement about this. So this is kind of funny. I haven't seen any, like, articles online about this, it's just in the documentation. So you've heard it first here, I guess, that Apex now, Mainline now updates runtime. And another funny thing, it's not related to quick updates. Not really. It looks like Google just didn't want anyone to touch it. So that's they like built a fence around it and said, don't touch it. But it's not about fast updates. They never explain why they want it. They say it's for consistency. Just for nobody touching it. This is so funny. There are other things related to consistency, like networking is basically 3 different APKs actually, related to networking, like IP services, captive portal, but it's not very interesting. Time zone data, everything related to time zone now in this Apex module. Previously it was APK, now it's Apex. They decided to change it. I'm not sure why, but they did it. And metadata is basically something for modules. So this is a module for module infrastructure. So it's very technical and not very interesting. So let's move to interesting part, the conclusion. So I talked to you about these modules that been updated, right? I've never mentioned anything about updates to new version of Android. That's because Mainline is not about quick updates to new versions of Android. And that's how Google announced it, like continuation of Treble, right? It's not even designed to do it. They not even tried. It's about small updates of certain components. So, what kind of components they want to update? First, if it's related to security, they want to push updates fast. Second, if it's related to privacy, because they want to make sure that privacy bugs fixed fast. And third one, if it's related to politics, like daytime saving changes, governments like to play with it, right? And Google wants to update this fast too. But also, what they haven't mentioned, and what has everything to do with runtime, is things that they don't want anyone to touch. It's not related to updates at all. So they just now have mechanism of building a small wall around certain portions of the system and saying, don't touch it. We forbid anyone to touch this portion of the system. It's still open source, but you cannot change it anymore if you're a device vendor. Why? Maybe because it's too important or too basic for anyone to change, but it's forbidden now. How is it all related to Treble? You remember I talked about Project Treble before? Well, from technical perspective, it's not related that much. I mean, there is some relation, there's some dependency, but it's really limited. What's more related to Treble is just overall ideology of how they've done it. With Treble, you have this separation of responsibility between chip vendor and device vendor. And with Mainline, they now separate some areas for Google. Like before that, Google was saying, here's the code, go have fun with it. You can do whatever you want. Well, to a certain degree, but still. And now they basically can build this small wall around this component and this component. Second one, how they did this, what this wall is about. It's basically an API. And they figured out the way to do this API. It needs to be stable, it needs to have versions, to have backward compatibility. So this is about, this is what's true about Treble, with like HIDL interfaces, it's HIDL interface definition language. This is true with Mainline and stable AADL. So ideology is the same. So did they found the solution for their problem? Will it work, right? When I was talking about Treble before, people asked me, will Treble work in my opinion? And I was saying, I'm not sure. Well, this will work. There is nothing ambiguous about this. It will work, but it will not make you updates faster. Because that's not what it's designed for. You will not get Android 11 faster than Android 10. You will not get Android 10 faster than Android 9 on your phone because of that. But what will it make? It will basically make it less relevant, because the most important part of your operation system related to security, your private data, this part will be updated. This part will be updated directly by Google. So what does it mean? Well, we can basically talk about this a lot, but first, you can expect that you will now get these updates, small updates, really often from Google, because they don't care. They can push it like applications, like application updates, bam, 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 twice a week. They don't care. So you'll have smaller updates, but they will be more frequent. In theory, it's not possible right now, but in theory, from technical perspective, there is nothing preventing Google from making it possible for third-party developers, for you, to develop parts of the system which will run on any device. And like publish it on Play Store, have people to download it. Like if you want to have, for example, some player for some specific audio format or some cool codec, you can still like play it, distribute on the Play Store. And it will be part of the system, no problem. So this can be something, some new work for you, some new opportunity. But it actually shows you the direction that Google thinks with updates in general and with the way they see the operation system. They're saying, hey, why do we need to have this monolith system which is really difficult to update to new version? Why not make it modular, not make it smaller, and basically get rid of the very notion of version of operation system, right? Because it can be just Android, period. And you update it by updating small parts of it, right? It's not like you have this big API and you update to a new version of API. API also can be split into modules. And you have separate API module for Bluetooth and separate API module for video. This is possible in theory, in future. This is the direction they go into, from what I can tell. So Android is not like one monolith anymore. It's going to be modular from now on. And this is very important for all of you if you have Android phones in your pocket. So thank you. That's everything I had to say.